Welcome to week 4 of Old Testament 531, the Hebrew prophets. First, I want to give you just a little bit of feedback on your journal reports. The biggest feedback is you did great work. You did great work on 2 levels. The first is finding some great articles. Articles that are deep, articles that stretched you, articles that had new insights, certainly articles that were worthy of academic research. So good on that first level. And then secondly, you clearly understood what the articles were talking about, and you were able to discuss them a little bit. At this point, I must admit that I underestimated what the word length should have been. I think I said 500 words, and really probably 1,000 words is more realistic. And this is a good point to say that so far I've never really felt the need to penalize people for going a little over in the word count. If you go over consistently 2 or 3 times what I've asked for, I'll get back to you privately. But if you go a little bit over and you do a good job, that's fine. Having said that, I want to talk about ways that you can make that 1,000 words really work, and the kind of 1,000-word report that I want to have. And the way to do that is to be very careful about the summarizing part. The summarizing is not a point-by-point retelling of everything the author said, but it's finding what the main point of the author is. And often in academic writing, a person will cover the whole spectrum of what everyone else has ever written on the topic before they get to telling their own perspective at the very end. And once you know what their perspective is, you can go back and look at what they said about the other viewpoints and say, oh, he's really describing accurately but also negatively why those other positions are not very good. And at the end then he says, having discredited every other viewpoint, mine is the one worth having. And that's a slight exaggeration of academic writing, but it's not too far off. And it gives you a hint. You look toward the end of the article to where the writer starts to really declare their own position. You want to read the whole thing, but as we summarize it, it's probably what's toward the end will be most helpful to you. Another way to summarize the article is to deal briefly with the most important thing that you learned. And sometimes the most important thing and the author's main point are this one and the same, which is wonderful. But at other times, there's something that you get that's really important to you, and you may not even understand what the article's about, whereas there's that one quote or that one paragraph that really sticks in your mind. Or it may be you disagree with the author. You know what the author's point is, but as he described someone else or she described someone else, you don't think, wow, that's the position I would go with. So summarize the article. It shouldn't take much more than a paragraph or maybe 2. You want to quickly tell what the point is, what the new insight that you gained is, and then move on to your discussion. And in this discussion, basically, you continued the discussion began by the author of the article. And one way you can do that is talk about the tools that the author used to make his or her point. You know, a lot of scripture perhaps being quoted, sound reasoning, perhaps appeal to other scholars. In some cases, it may be the use of analogy or irony, other ways of making a point. But what tools did they use to make their point? Secondly, was the argument persuasive? And what made it persuasive, or what made it lacking in its ability to convince you? How does this argument complement or contradict what you already know? In your mind, is it really built on a good biblical basis, or does it move away from that? Does it reinforce and help you and give richness and more passion to what you know is right, or does it kind of move outside and in a negative way challenge true biblical faith? Or another thing you might want to talk about is how you can use the new information. Now, you don't have to do all these every time in an article, but they, when you do an article report, but they give you a little bit of an idea, and they will be useful to you to look back to when we have our next article that's due on one of the major prophets. Okay, we want to do just a little bit of thinking on mourning. Last week we talked about how the prophets are those who understand the gap between God's expectation and the performance of God's people, and how that incites God's wrath. Today we're talking on another emotional response, both of God and of the prophet, and that's mourning. We can put it this way. What does the prophet do when they see the religion of an almighty God being reduced to reinforcing civic pride? Or when the spiritual values of a loving God are reduced to advertisements to buy more things? Or when God's concern for the poor somehow is transformed into a system where all that happens is the rich get richer? And these are things that happen today, but they're also things that happened in Jeremiah's day. The religion of God reduced to reinforcing civic pride. Spiritual values in the eternals reduced to buy stuff now. And God's concern for the poor somehow used to rationalize the rich getting richer. What happens when the prophet encounters that? The prophet mourns. It's a sad day. This is grieving. The prophet mourns the end of true faith. There is this grieving because something that once was valuable, faithfulness according to God's precepts, is now lost and perhaps even forgotten, or at least severely warped. The prophet mourns the end of hope and the blunting of future. People no longer hope. We're not talking just about the prophet, although we are, but we're talking about whole societies that instead of having a hope for the future, just try to hang on to today. For when the king or the president or the CEO tells us that everything is just right the way they are today, that person is asking us to ignore possibilities for improving the future. At least it can come across that way. Certainly, those involved in the power structure that reinforces their values today, those folks don't want us thinking about a better future, because if you're already doing well in the status quo, a better future means change. And change for those who are in power means a loss of power. At least it's often felt that way. So in the midst of all of this, hearing the people in power saying everything's just fine, just grunt it out for another day, the prophet mourns the loss of hope. Brueggemann talks about this very poetically. And so there's a whole paragraph of meaning hidden into every expression, and you might want to read it slowly and try to unpack all the imagery that he's bringing out. As Brueggemann talks about the prophetic task of mourning, pathos, think slowly about phrases like, quote unquote, bring people to engage their experience of death. Bring people to engage their experience of death, becoming aware of the fact that not all is good in life, in any normal life. There's things that we cherish that fall away as well. And so we want to put people in touch with that. Or another one is reactivating religious symbols as vehicles for redemptive honesty. What does it mean for a religious symbol, for instance, the cross, to be a vehicle for redemptive honesty? Another symbol, another way in which the church engages redemptive honesty is the communion service. He goes on to say that tears are a way of solidarity in pain, page 56. solidarity in pain, that one of the ways that we connect with other people experiencing grief and mourning is to cry with them. Well, all of these phrases are powerful phrases. They make me think, they make me feel, and they make me wonder, what is there about living today that really connects with living with those in Judea in 600 BC? And as I think about that, as I really feel those primal longings and hope and blunting of hope and the grief and the pain, I think maybe there's not so much difference between the way we are today and the way they were back then. And this is one of the things that mourning does for us. It connects us to other people. So last week, I had you identify with God's anger. What is it that makes God angry? And what is there in our experience today especially? What do we see around us in our churches or in our society that we've just accepted as normal and okay and acceptable, and yet God's wrath burns against it? As we think about that, we can imagine ourselves being pitted against the audience. We want to be angry at them. And that is one reason why we don't usually even go with the idea of anger. And so this week it's maybe a little bit easier to deal with, because we're going to identify with God's mourning, aligns us with God's heart, but it's also God saying, I'm not just angry at you. More than that, I'm grieving the loss of you. I'm grieving the loss of your commitment to me. I'm grieving those parts of pain that you will now experience that you wouldn't have if you had stayed true to my purposes. So for your assignment, you want to take that situation that you chose last week that incites God's wrath, and then say, what kind of grief does this produce for you or for God? And especially as you go through Jeremiah, but through the other prophets as well, you will see examples of how God and his prophet grieves for the loss of those things which are really most fundamental to being wonderfully human and wonderfully part of God's enterprise in the world. As you express that, you can do it through prose, which is the essay, or through poetry. It's at least 150 words. It might be 200 or even a little bit more. And in this, this really allows you to identify with your audience, because it's a statement of grieving, not a statement of condemning. We need to point out the reality of where people have stepped outside of God's grace and outside of God's design. And that was more last week. But this week, we're talking about this is the painful things that you experience because of that. And I'm grieving with you for the loss of those. I posted a web link this week to a source for some well-done videos about the Holy Land, and they bring out some of the history and some of the richness of the land of Jerusalem and Judea. And I did this because, number one, it's good stuff, and we find in Jeremiah such a longing for Jerusalem and bemoaning the loss of Jerusalem's faithfulness and then of its sense of sovereignty. And I think a few good videos help make Jerusalem seem more real to us. But I also did it as a way to opening a discussion on our prayer/question section, that if you know of good biblical resources, and especially ones that help us give a visual impression of what life in the time of Jeremiah or life in the Holy Land today is like, I'd love to have you post those, and it'd be a way that we can share with each other. Well, grieving sounds like a sad, dismal, morbid thing, but in a very real way, I think it's a way where we get touch with some deep levels of our humanity, some deep ways in which we connect with other people. And as we start to deal with the honesty about mourning, we prepare ourselves to what we'll get into next week, which is the glory of God's promise. But this week, we're in mourning. It allows us to experience the fullness of the crucifixion in terms of New Testament terms, which then, of course, is setting us up for the resurrection, for the promise that God gives us next week. God bless you as you go through this week's reading, discussions, and assignment, and I look forward to our interaction together.